Okay, take two because I went too far off script and I got lost in the fog of my own thoughts. So, welcome back to Critical Weight Theory. Today we're looking at one of the more obscure corners of horror cinema, The Birds 2 Land's End. And this is going to be a little bit more of an actual review compared to my look at Tales of the Wizard of Oz earlier today, which was more of just a recommendation of a cute 1960s cartoon about the Wizard of Oz. Well, this is an actual uh, sequel to The Birds. Yeah, you heard that right. The Alfred Hitchcock classic. One of the best horror movies, or at least one of the best horror movies about birds. So, if you look at the main photo that I used for this episode, it's an image of Richard K. Olsen as the character Doc Rayburn, and he's quoted saying some harsh words to those dang birds, those peckerheads in the sky. Now, The Birds 2 is a 1994 made for TV horror film directed by Rick Rosenthal and written by Ken Wheat and Jim Wheat. It's often just called The Birds 2, or the full title is, of course, The Birds 2 Land's End. And is it as good as Alfred Hitchcock's 1963 classic, The Birds, which was itself based on a story about killer birds? Well, I think very few people on this planet would say that it's a worthwhile sequel to The Birds. It's a testament to the power of the industry to create sequels. But Tippi Hedren, who makes a cameo in this movie, went on record saying that it's a horrible movie and that she regrets it, and that whole thing. So how bad is the movie? Is it really as bad as some people say, including Tippi Hedren? Well, it's actually not the worst movie that I've seen or the worst sequel I've ever seen or whatever. So Uh, I do want to do a quick plug here. If you haven't yet, check out my full episode on the birds, where I went into some of the theories behind why the birds attacked in the original film. It's not really a review of the birds exactly, but I'm more discussing the nature of the bird attacks, like what's provoking them, what are the different theories about why they're going all crazy, and I'll probably do a more, I guess, simple review of the original Birds someday, because it is a classic. So stay tuned for that at some point. But for now we're just going to be talking about this crappy sequel. So back to Land's End. The story is set on a place called Gull Island, which is very much on the nose, but hey, why not? It's apparently off the coast of California. And whether Gull Island is entirely fictional or just a heavily fictionalized version of a real place is up for debate, because there probably are some islands that are known for a heavy bird presence, and maybe this was partially inspired by that. I don't know, but the sequel setup is actually pretty familiar, and you're not going to be too surprised that the birds show up and start attacking local residents. That really is the core element here. But unlike Hitchcock's version, where the cause was left ambiguous, the birds too, it actually does us a favor by leaning hard into the official explanation. This time it's toxic waste. Yep, the mystery's gone on this one. The humans dumping toxic sludge on a nearby island has poisoned the birds, turning them aggressive and, maybe giving them extra strength or something. Like, look what happened to the Incredible Hulk, or the Toxic Avenger, or the, you know, uh, other, like the Chuds. Remember the movie Chud? I'm planning to eventually do a movie review of that. Well, the chud element was a radioactive or nuclear thing, radioactive waste or just some kind of toxic sludge. And in this case it was driving these birds crazy and they just had to take it out, against these stupid people. So, let's talk about the cast for a little bit. I don't always do this cuz you can always go to IMDb, but I'll do it here. There's Brad Johnson starring as Ted. And for a fun fact, Brad also played a character named Ted in Always, a Steven Spielberg movie that's a lot sappier, but honestly a better watch. And Brad passed away not that long ago. So it's one of the reasons I'm gonna go a little bit easier on this movie today. Rest in peace, Brad. It's it's also just not quite as bad of a movie as some people suggest. I'll explain some of what makes it bad, though, toward the end. There's Chelsea Field, who plays May, Ted's wife, and her character constantly seems like she's about one awkward conversation away from having an affair. So there's a little bit of a, human element to the story, but it's mostly just to, make the movie seem deeper than it actually is. We also get James Naughton as Frank, Jan Rubens as Carl, and like I said, Tippi Hedren shows up too. She's really the big cameo, the big get for this movie. You might remember, she starred as Melanie Daniels in the original movie The Birds, but here she plays a new character named Helen. It's a bit of a weird choice, honestly. It feels like a missed opportunity not to connect it more directly to her original role. But I suppose at the end of the day, maybe that's for the best. I, I think I think really the star of this movie is those attacking and screeching, annoying birds. They're a they're a menace, and they're they're still fun to watch in this movie. I mean, bird attacks are a fun concept. So I think if you're going to create a horror movie and you're looking for an animal to like have go nuts, a bird attack is actually a pretty safe bet, really. So reception wise, of course, this movie didn't do great. People often don't want to remember it. It's also one of those movies that people sort of hopped on the bandwagon against. It's sort of hip to hate this one. The Birds 2 Land's End got mostly negative reviews from critics and audiences alike. And the main complaints were a weak storyline, unconvincing special effects, and honestly, just the boldness of making a sequel to a stone cold Hitchcock masterpiece. But really, one of my chief complaints is simply that the movie feels unfinished. It's a very simple complaint, but a lot of the critiques I've seen of this movie don't mention that, that often. Well, not that I looked at that many reviews of this. I don't want to give a false idea here that I spent like months and months researching this or something, but it's the main complaint that I have is oddly that simple, just that it feels incomplete. Like they just leave the survivors just stranded. And I'm not one of those people who's always against open-ended movies too. Like The Thing by John Carpenter, it obviously has an open end, and it's actually a good movie. It's almost better because of that open-ended decision. And well, John Carpenter's Prince of Darkness also has a pretty neat open end involving a mirror. And there are some other ones too. Like I think the end of A Nightmare on Elm Street, the original one, isn't as bad as some people suggest, including Wes Craven. He's been critical of that end. But if you think about that movie as maybe it was all just, the dream of Nancy and, the confusion of the dream world is shaping the entire storyline. I mean, my theory on the original Nightmare on Elm Street is that the whole thing was indeed a dream. At some point she first heard about Freddy Krueger, and she must have heard that her parents were involved in his murder or something like that, and then she had this nightmare about him coming back to attack her family and friends and whatnot. And if you think about that and really assess it as just an entirely dreamlike horror story, it makes the end. It actually improves it, I think. But in this case, no, it's nothing that you know complicated. They just kind of dropped the ball on the ending. They should have wrapped things up a little bit better. Like the original story of the birds, that movie is open ended, but it's a sort of beautiful ending in a way. It's a set, there's a sense that life will go on in some way. There's a suggestion that the world is still chaotic, but that there will be moments of calm, maybe even tranquility. The birds sort of represent nature and life itself, perhaps, as some things being unexplainable, as chaos or violence erupts. But eventually, things might die down a little bit, and some people will be survivors, and all that kind of stuff. This movie just doesn't have that sense, and it's unfortunate because I think it really would have actually improved this movie. I'm not BSing on that point. I really do think that this movie would have been better if it just had a somewhat better ending to it. It wouldn't even need to be seen as a masterpiece, but I think people would remember this more fondly if they had just taken care to, wrap things up in a little bit more of a convincing and compelling manner. So the comparisons to the original were inevitable, of course, and they were brutal. Hitchcock's The Birds is a masterclass in suspense and atmosphere. This one, not nearly as much. And I don't want to pick on this movie that much or peck at this movie that much, but uh, The Birds 2 Land's End has kind of faded into obscurity for a reason. It's more of a curious footnote for horror fans than a movie anyone seriously revisits. But at the same time, you might still want to check it out because you might be one of those freakazoids who actually really loves this movie. One of the rare breed who's like, yeah, The Birds 2 is, a great film. Again, almost nobody says it, but maybe you would be one of those ones. I will say it's better than any of the Birdemic movies, but that kind of goes without saying. But anyway, that's about it for today's episode. If you enjoyed this deep cut or this deep peck into horror sequel history, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, or just scream or squawk into the sky like a possessed seagull. So, catch you next time. Stay weird and you know, don't uh don't let the birds bite. Well, that's sort of a variation on don't let the bed bugs bite, but I guess don't let the birds. Well, whatever. I don't know. Anyway, have a good one.